それではお時間となりましたので、イベントを開始いたします。参加者の皆さん、おはようございます。プロクシーウォッチャーの松木です。本日はウェビナー、水素は Gx の切り札か、エネルギー活用における可能性とリスクについて、リスクにご参加いただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。このウェビナーは、プロクシーウォッチャーと一般社団法人クライメート大学の共催で実施しております。まずはじめにご連絡事項をご案内いたします。本ウェビナーでは、英語から日本語へのですね、同時通訳を行っております。画面、真ん中の、地球アイコンから言語をご選択の上、ご視聴ください。また、本ウェビナー中にお困りごとがございましたら、私宛てにチャットをお送りください。本イベントの後半に Q&A セッションを予定しております。パネリストへのご質問は時間の許す限りお答えいたします。ぜひ、Q&A ボックスに、ご投稿ください。セッション中でのご質問も大歓迎です。ご質問は私が、代読して、ホワース先生に、ご質問させていただきます。それでは、まずはじめに本日のパネリストをご紹介させていただきます。本日は、コーネル大学環境学教授のロバート・ホワースさんにご登壇いただきます。ホワースさんはコーネル大学で教鞭を取る傍らですね、ニューヨーク州の、気候行動協議会の、委員として、ニューヨーク州のですね、エネルギー政策の議論に、深く関わってリードされていらっしゃいます。こちら、ウェビナーに少し入る前にですね、日本の、水素利用について、まず簡単なところから、基本的なところから、フォローさせていただいてから、ホワースさんに、ウェビナーのキーノートを、していただこうと思っております。ちょっとこちらからホワース先生に、英語でご質問させていただきますので、英語で失礼いたします。日本語、希望の方は、翻訳ボタンで日本語のチャンネルからお聞きください。So, Professor Forrest, thank you so much for speaking
ホワー
today
ス先
to
生、
journalists
本日はジャーナリストの
and
皆さん
journalists.
にご講演いただきましてありがとうございます。
Let me, stop by a little.
ちょっとお待ちください。
Sorry, excuse me.
失礼し
So
ま
I'd
し
like
た。
to touch on how much Japan will rely on hydrogen as a
日
future
本が
energy
今
source.
後水素にどれだけ依存するかということに触れておきたいと思います。
According to the latest plans, Japan aims
最新の
to
計画で
secure
は日
3
本は
million tons of a year
2030年
hydrogen
までに年
by
間
2030
300万トンを、
and
そし
20
て
million tons by 2050.
2050年までに2000
Also,
万トンの水
according
素
to
を
the
確保しようと
disclosures
していま
from
す。
Japanese
さ
government,
らに日
the
本政府の
country
発表により
is
ますと、
expanding the use of hydrogen
鉄鋼、電力
in
セクターで
transport,
水素利用
steel,
を
and
拡大
utility sectors
す
too.
ると、そういった発表
Therefore,
がありました。
it
で
seems
すの
that it's
で、
hard to
水素な
envision
しに
Japanese energy
日本がエ
transition
ネルギー
without
転換を
hydrogen.
実現することは困難な
But
ように思われます。
Professor Forrest, you pointed out
た
in
だ、
your piece to
先
Nikkei
生
Asia
は
last year, for example,
去年の日経アジアの機構
that
の中で、
without a proper understanding of the climate impact of
ブ
blue
ルー水素
hydrogen,
が気候に与える影響を正し
policymakers of
く
Japan may
理
be
解し
opting
ないままで、日
for
本の
hydrogen
政
that is
策
even
立案
worse
者は
for climate change than
化石
simply
燃
burning
料を
fossil
燃焼さ
fuels.
せるよりも気候に悪
And
い
most
水素を
importantly, you
選ぶこ
said
とになるか
that
もしれないと
blue
指摘さ
hydrogen
れていま
is
す。
far from clean.
さらにブルー水素はグリーンと
So
は程
could you
遠い
start
とおっ
from
しゃっていました
introducing
ね。
what types of
ど
hydrogen
んな
are there
種類の水素
first
が実際
and
存
tell
在
us
するの
about
かを
your
まず
research
説
on
明し
blue
ていただ
hydrogen?
いて、ブルー水素についての研究についてお知らせください。
So it's all yours, Mr. Forrest. Thank you so much.
ではお願いします。
はい、それではスライドを少し進めてください。1、2枚進めていただきたいと思います。スライドを進めていただけますか。
Excuse me, one more?
That's good.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be able to talk with you all this morning. And let me start by describing the various ways that hydrogen can be made. The industry usually classifies hydrogen by color in order to describe how it's made. And in this slide, I'm showing you some of the major forms of hydrogen that are made now and that we are thinking about for the future. So at the top there, brown hydrogen is hydrogen made from coal, the coal is gasified to break it down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And on the right, I'm showing you an estimate for what the greenhouse gas emissions are for using that in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And it's high, it's about 26. That's a big number. The next box down there is gray hydrogen, also making hydrogen from fossil fuels. But in this case, we're making it from natural gas instead of from coal. And natural gas is mostly methane. So the natural gas here is both the chemical feedstock and the source of energy for making this gray hydrogen. The methane in natural gas is put under high pressure, high temperatures from burning natural gas, and the methane breaks down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. It too has a very high greenhouse gas emissions, pretty much similar to brown hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is my major focus for this morning, and it's a fairly new concept. It's the same as gray hydrogen. It's made by breaking methane from natural gas down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. But there's some effort to capture some of the carbon dioxide as opposed to just letting it be emitted to the environment. Our research shows that it still has a high greenhouse gas emission. We'll come back and talk about that in some length, but it's not really that much better than gray hydrogen. And then finally, we should consider green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is not made from fossil fuels. It's made using renewable electricity, which is used to electrolyze water and break the water down into hydrogen and oxygen. And it has a much, much smaller greenhouse gas emission. So next slide, please. Well, if we look today, 96% of all the hydrogen production globally is coming from fossil fuels. In North America and Europe, it's virtually all from natural gas. In China, it's mostly coal, but with some natural gas. Other countries are split in between. So 2/3 of the total hydrogen globally is the gray hydrogen that's coming from natural gas. And again, to make hydrogen from that form, the natural gas, which is mostly methane, is the chemical feedstock. We take that under high pressure and temperature by burning even more natural gas, and it breaks down. That's gray hydrogen. Next slide, please. So blue hydrogen, the same as gray hydrogen. We're taking methane and natural gas, we're putting it under pressure and temperature, we're breaking it down into carbon dioxide and hydrogen, but then there's some effort to capture that carbon dioxide. And this is a new idea. The first use of the term blue hydrogen was just back in 2015. It's a marketing idea that came originally from the French gas company Air Liquide. Since 2017 or 2018, it's been very heavily promoted globally by the oil and gas industry, particularly by a group called the Hydrogen Council. And this was a group set up by British Petroleum, Shell, Total, ExxonMobil, and others in 2017. As of today, this has only been made commercially, blue hydrogen that is commercially, in 2 facilities anywhere in the world, one here in the United States in Texas and one in Canada. Next slide. So the industry's very heavily promoted this idea of blue hydrogen. They have tried to make us think that we can make this hydrogen from natural gas and have it be a major part of a decarbonized future. And they often call it either having zero emissions or nearly zero emissions or very, very low carbon emissions. Is that true? That's my major topic for this morning. The next slide. Well, I only first heard about blue hydrogen back in 2020 or so. I'm on a commission for the state of New York that's charged with coming up with our energy future in a decarbonized future. And the oil and gas industry tried to convince us that blue hydrogen should play a major part of that, basically substituting for natural gas in gas distribution pipelines going to industry and people's homes. I was a little skeptical when I first heard of this as a zero emissions fuel, but I went and tried to find the data that would support this idea that it was a low emissions fuel. And it turns out there was really no science behind that at all. It really was just a marketing idea from oil and gas. So I worked with a colleague of mine, Mark Jacobson, who's an engineer on the faculty at Stanford University in California. And we produced a paper that analyzed the greenhouse gas emissions from blue hydrogen. We published it back in August of 2021. And ours, to this day, is one of the very few peer-reviewed analyses of the greenhouse gas footprint of either gray or blue hydrogen. It was the first ever for blue hydrogen, still one of the very few for gray hydrogen. And we were the first for either gray or blue hydrogen to include methane emissions in addition to carbon dioxide. And that's important. Next slide. So our analysis is pretty straightforward. There are just a handful of input parameters that drive our calculations. One of those is that there's a lot of natural gas involved in this process. Again, it's the chemical feedstock for the methane, and we're burning the natural gas. And you can't develop and use natural gas without having some of the methane in natural gas escape unburned to the atmosphere. So for our default assumption, we said 3.5% of the methane in natural gas is emitted to the atmosphere. There's uncertainty around that, so we did a sensitivity analysis. We said it might be as low as about 1.5%, or it might be as high as 4.3%. We'll come back to that. Our next input is how one compares methane to carbon dioxide, because methane is an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas. It's more than 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide for the time it's in the atmosphere, but it doesn't stay in the atmosphere for as long. So you need to pick some time frame over which you're comparing them. We used a 20-year time period, which I believe is the best value to use, but often governments will use a 100-year time period, and we'll come back and talk about that in the sensitivity analysis as well. Next, we looked at how much of the carbon dioxide is actually captured, and in this case, from the steam methane reforming process. That's the carbon dioxide that's released when the methane is broken down. And we used a value of 85%. That's based, that's an optimistic good number based on the 2 operating plants to date. For our sensitivity analysis, we went down to 79%, which is what one of the plants actually does. And we said it could be as high as 90% because industry thinks they can do that well. And then we also looked at the carbon dioxide that's captured from burning the natural gas that's used to provide the heat and pressure for the steam methane reforming process. And currently, they don't try to do that. It's very, very difficult. In fact, no one has ever tried to capture carbon dioxide from burning natural gas. It's difficult. So far, they haven't tried, so our default value there is 0. But based on the best that's ever been done for coal burning power plants, we said, well, perhaps industry could capture up to 65% if they work at it hard. And we used a sensitivity analysis of down to 55%, which is the low end value for coal plants, and as high as 90%, which is far better than any coal plant has ever done. But some industry engineers think perhaps in the future that could happen. So those are the input parameters. Next slide, please. And this is our major result. Here we're looking at the greenhouse gas emissions and carbon dioxide equivalents for a common unit of energy released per megajoule. And we're looking both at carbon dioxide direct emissions, which are that yellow color, and we're looking at methane emissions converted to carbon dioxide equivalents, and that's the red color. So to the left are the bars for gray hydrogen. It's a large footprint. Blue hydrogen is next, and you can see it's a little bit lower than gray hydrogen, but it's certainly not 0 emissions or almost low emissions. It's quite high. Carbon dioxide emissions are lower because they're capturing some of that, but the methane emissions are higher, and that's because it takes energy to capture the carbon dioxide as well, and they're burning even more natural gas to power that, with more methane emissions associated with that. And then for comparison, we're looking at fossil fuels, natural gas, diesel, oil, and coal. And you can see that though the blue hydrogen is marginally better than gray hydrogen, it's in fact worse than any fossil fuel you'd want to burn. It's worse than if you simply use the natural gas that you're using to power this. So fundamentally, what the industry is telling us is that this idea that we could have a decarbonized future by using blue hydrogen instead of natural gas, it's false. It's just completely false. Next slide. A little bit of additional complexity here. I'm showing you two different calculations for blue hydrogen. So under that bar, blue bar at the top, the one to the left is what I just showed you. I'm adding another bar for what we project would happen if industry were to try and capture the carbon dioxide emissions from the natural gas that they're burning as well. And the carbon dioxide emissions go down a little bit more, although they can't go down that much because the carbon dioxide capture just isn't that effective. And the methane emissions go up even more because, again, it takes even more natural gas to power that carbon dioxide capture. It's not an easy thing to do. And so overall, the emissions are about the same whether you try to do that or not. Blue hydrogen still has a very, very large greenhouse gas footprint. Next slide. Now, the key here is to understand why we're worried about methane, because it's the methane emissions that are most problematic with blue hydrogen. And again, you can't produce and use natural gas without having some methane emitted unburned to the atmosphere. So this is from the sixth synthesis report of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the United Nations, from a year and a half ago now. And on the left, we're looking at the total net warming of the Earth to date. We've warmed the planet by 1.1 degrees since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And that's a result of warming agents, greenhouse gas that cause warming, which is the next bar over there, about 1.5 degrees. But we're also putting in things which cool the atmosphere a little bit, sulfur dioxide, et cetera. So it's those combinations that result in the net warming. When we look at the agents of warming, the greenhouse gases which do it, the next slide over to the right, carbon dioxide is the most important, but methane is a very, very close second. And next slide. Next, thank you. Yes. If we look at the entire time since the 1800s of what humans have done to warm the atmosphere, methane has contributed about a third of the entire warming. So methane is very, very important in a way which people just don't understand. Next slide. In a little bit of historical context, back at the COP21 in December of 2015 in Paris, countries of the world came together under the auspices of the United Nations and agreed to keep the planet well below 2 degrees Celsius. And there was a clear recognition that approaching 1.5 degrees Celsius is dangerous, and we're on a pathway to do that in the next 10 to 12 years, given current trends. What I want you to know is that we cannot reach those COP21 targets by focusing just on carbon dioxide. We must reduce methane emissions to reach those. And so we want to do everything we can to avoid putting more methane into the atmosphere. Next slide. And unfortunately, we're not doing that. So this is the amount of methane that's in the atmosphere, going back to the early 1980s and up to the present, basically. Methane was rising rapidly in the atmosphere in the 20th century. It actually slowed down at the start of this century for a decade or so, but it's been rising again very rapidly since 2010. It's now rising at the most rapid rate it's ever been. And my research and that of others shows that the major cause of this increase is shale gas production, natural gas produced out of shale using high volume hydraulic fracturing, largely in the United States. So again, these methane emissions are important, they're globally important, and natural gas is a big part of the culprit. Next slide. So why is this problematic? Why are we releasing methane when we produce and use natural gas? And it's coming from a variety of sources. One of which is that when we develop shale gas, we're drilling wells deep down into the ground, 5-6 kilometers deep and more. And it's going through areas that often have a history of oil and gas and coal production in the past 100 and 150 years. And there are pockets of methane from that associated with that we're hitting and releasing into the atmosphere. Another is that we produce a lot of wells, and we have what they're called gathering lines, rather cheap, inexpensive lines that industry puts in to pull this towards a common processing facility, and they tend to be leaky, they're poorly made. When we store gas and when we process the gas, some of it vents to the atmosphere. This isn't a leak, it's not an accident. It's done purposely to control the pressure and the things and minimize the risk of explosions. And then sometimes, rather than just venting unburned methane, industry will try to flare the gas, that is to burn it to carbon dioxide, but flares do a poor job of burning it. So some of the methane is unburned and the flares go out and the gas is vented again. Another issue is that the compressors, which are commonly used to put the gas into high pressure pipelines, those are powered themselves by burning the natural gas, and they don't burn it very effectively. So they're releasing unburned methane again, not a leak. It's a purposeful design of the compressors. And then when you go to do maintenance on a pipeline, you can't do it with methane in the pipeline. It would be an explosion hazard. So they release all of the gas to the atmosphere for that as well. So on average, there's a lot of emissions of methane. Next slide. For our paper, we used a default value saying it was about 3.5% on average. That was the best estimate we could come up with as of a year and a half, 2 years ago when we wrote that paper. I've written a more recent review that I published 2 months ago. Newer data, more data. We now have 20 really good estimates from across the United States, and the estimate looks to be a little bit higher, about 3.7%. But I've grown increasingly sure that we used a good value. If anything, we're a little conservative in the estimates we made in our paper. Next slide. So again, our paper is very transparent. The calculations are clear, and it's driven by these relatively few input parameters that I've described before. We use the best available data for estimates for our baseline analysis, and those are good values, good data behind them. But we also performed a sensitivity analysis just to make sure that even if there's some error in our assumptions, that our conclusions wouldn't be false. And I'd like to show you some of those sensitivity analyses in the next slide. So here we're looking at changing assumptions about methane emissions and also how we compare the time frame of methane to carbon dioxide. And across the top, we're looking at gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, either where we don't capture the carbon dioxide from burning the fuel, only from the steam methane reforming process, or the next one over where we are capturing both, and we're comparing with natural gas in this case. And so the top part I've highlighted there, what I'm calling our baseline analysis, those are the values I showed you a minute ago in the figure. And now I'll show you the worst case and the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that the methane emissions are actually higher than what we had assumed, and that methane is even a little bit more powerful as a greenhouse gas than we had assumed. So we're using solid values from the literature here on what the warming might be. It's a little bit higher. Take-home lesson for that worst case scenario is that across the board, all of the emissions for hydrogen and natural gas go up, and they go up more or less in proportion, and our take-home message is the same. Blue hydrogen is slightly better than gray hydrogen, not by much, and far worse than just burning natural gas. Our best case scenario at the bottom is if the methane emissions are low, only 1.5%, and I think that's unrealistically low, but it's possible. And now we're saying we're not going to compare over a 20-year time period with carbon dioxide, but rather over a 100-year time period, which is what most governments do, but that's based on really, really old, out-of-date science, and it hugely underplays what methane really does to climate. So it's not a good thing to do. But if we were to do that, that's the best case you can put for blue hydrogen. And you can see that it still isn't all that better. All of the numbers go down because of these assumptions, but blue hydrogen still isn't all that much better than gray hydrogen. And it's about the same as natural gas. It's certainly no better than just burning natural gas, even under these hugely optimistic assumptions. Next slide. So in our paper, we didn't worry about hydrogen itself when it's leaked to the atmosphere having a greenhouse gas consequence. Hydrogen is not a greenhouse gas, so we just completely ignored that part of it. But there's new research that has come out in the 18 months since our paper was published, saying actually there's some concern here too. Hydrogen is the smallest molecule in the universe. It's very leaky. It's going to be hard to not have some of it leak out. And although it's not a greenhouse gas itself, when it's in the atmosphere, it makes methane stay in the atmosphere longer, which makes methane a bigger problem. It produces more ozone, which is a greenhouse gas, and it puts more water vapor into the stratosphere, which also increases global warming. So for the next slide, I'll show you how that affects our calculations. Just a variant on the plot I've shown you before, but now I'm adding on the consequences of hydrogen here in blue, and it makes blue hydrogen even worse relative to natural gas. And over on the left, you can see green hydrogen. That's the hydrogen made without any fossil fuels, just from 100% renewable electricity, and certainly better than any other hydrogen, but it's not without its greenhouse gas consequences, as shown by this bar. Next slide. So this is the same slide I've showed you before, but now I've shown you where these numbers are coming from, and I'm giving you a range of values. So the range for the greenhouse gas emissions from gray hydrogen, our mean estimate is 25 kilograms per kilogram of hydrogen, but the range out of our sensitivity analysis is 14 to 32. So there's uncertainty there. For blue hydrogen, again, it's only slightly better than gray hydrogen, and the uncertainty is 9 to 31. So it's never all that much better than gray hydrogen. For green hydrogen, again, we have a value of 3 because of the indirect effects of hydrogen leakage, and the range there is 1 to 5. Next slide. So just a little bit more on hydrogen in general. I hope I've convinced you that blue hydrogen is a terrible idea from a climate perspective. The oil and gas industry is promoting it heavily anyway, globally. Every single country in the world, they have public relations efforts out telling leaders, politicians, the public that it's a good thing. It is not. But a little bit more about hydrogen in general. Note in the past that hydrogen has been used almost entirely as a chemical feedstock and not as a fuel. It's been used in oil refining, it's used to make plastic, it's used to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. This idea of using as a fuel is really quite new. Now, progressive energy planners have been talking about hydrogen as a fuel for quite some time. They're talking about green hydrogen and particularly hard to decarbonize sectors. So air travel may make sense, steel manufacturing certainly makes sense. Perhaps also for storage of surplus electricity from wind and solar. When you have surplus solar beyond what you can use, you produce hydrogen, you store it temporarily, feed it back into the electric grid through a fuel cell when you need the electricity again. But since 2017, this idea of blue hydrogen, the fossil fuel hydrogen, has been heavily promoted by oil and gas and heavily forced towards using it in gas pipeline delivery systems to heat homes and things like that. And since our paper came out in 2021 criticizing blue hydrogen, the industry, at least in the United States, has shifted, and they don't use the blue hydrogen terminology anymore. They now call it clean electricity, clean hydrogen, and they sort of mix green and blue, which is they're totally different beasts. Next slide. So I want to make a strong point that we really do not want to be using hydrogen of any form, even the green, for putting into pipeline systems and heating homes. And there are a variety of reasons for that. It's unsafe, among others, and I can go into detail on that if you like. But even if you somehow were able to solve the safety concerns, it's a hugely inefficient way to use renewable electricity. So again, the green hydrogen is coming from renewable electricity. As we move towards a fossil fuel-free future, a carbon-free future, renewable electricity is one of the most precious resources we have. We want to use it as efficiently as we can so we can defossilize as quickly as we can. And if we use that renewable electricity to produce hydrogen, as you're seeing on the left here, we're making the hydrogen from electrolysis. You transport the hydrogen to a home and you burn it. And there are a lot of losses there. The overall efficiency is in the neighborhood of about 46%. If you took the same amount of renewable electricity and instead took it to the home through the electric grid with no hydrogen, and you use it to drive a high efficiency modern heat pump of the sorts that Mitsubishi, for instance, makes, and we use widely here in the United States, they have efficiencies that are much, much higher than one. They're taking energy out of the environment, and so they're producing more heat energy than you're putting in. And as a result, you end up with 6 to 10 times more heat in the home than if you were to combust the green hydrogen. So again, hydrogen, even this clean hydrogen, the green hydrogen, is an inefficient way to heat homes. And we want to really use hydrogen and renewable electricity as efficiently as we possibly can. I think the next slide is my final slide. Yep, indeed, it's blue hydrogen is not green as our take-home message. I'm very confident in our results. Our conclusions are robust over a wide range of assumptions, and far from having zero or low emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions from blue hydrogen are very, very high, worse than if you just burned fossil natural gas or other fossil fuels. And I just want to acknowledge that we've had help for more than a decade here, both from Cornell University and from the Park Foundation, to pay for our research on this, which I very much appreciate it. And I appreciate the chance to have been able to talk with you this morning. Questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Horst. Let me actually make a housekeeping announcement a little for Q&A sessions in Japanese. 今から、ホワース先生への、Q&A を、実施したいと思いますけれども、Q&A は、ご質問はですね、Q&A ボックスに、お書きいただければと思います。後で、ピックアップさせていただきます。すでに、いつもいただいております。ありがとうございます。こちらも後で、ピックアップさせていただきます。Q&A セッションの前にですね、ホワース先生にちょっと、キーとなる質問をこちらから、事務課、運営からさせていただきます。So, Dr. Horst, before we open up the questions from the audiences, actually, I wanted to ask you questions, key questions, because we have people here who are working on responsible investment, also what people who are covering energy issues and climate change issues in media world. So let me actually ask the questions that is good for audiences as well. So first question is, from your science viewpoint, why do you think the energy companies are promoting blue hydrogen in Japan actually, especially as the situation to the greenhouse gas problem? What are the benefits for those energy giants to promote blue hydrogen? Even if you pointed out, as you pointed out, that blue hydrogen is not green. That is my first question to you.
Right. No, I think it's I can't speak to the specifics of Japan, but I've watched closely what's going on in the United States and also in many European countries and in the United Kingdom. And in at least my country and in the European Union, this is driven not by good engineering, but by public relations and marketing. And so, I speak with engineers who work for the oil and gas industry, and they understand the issues I just went through. They really do. This idea, again, it originated 2015, the first time it's brought up. It's coming from the marketing forces of the oil and gas industry. So look, the oil and gas industry is starting to see that the world is getting serious about climate change. This is right after COP21 in Paris that they came up with this idea. And they started talking very, very hard about carbon capture and storage. So we're going to burn oil, we're going to burn natural gas, coal as well for electricity, and we're going to have carbon capture and storage, and that will, in their minds, take care of the problem. Well, carbon capture is pretty problematic. It doesn't work as effectively as many people would like. But let's just say you could make it work, and let's say you could make it work perfectly. The oil and gas industry still has a problem because most of the natural gas, certainly in the United States, and I think globally, is not used to make electricity. It is used to heat homes and small commercial buildings through this pipeline distribution system. And no one has seriously ever said that we're going to capture carbon dioxide at the site of combustion in individual homes. No one thinks that's reasonable. So instead, they came up with this idea that we'll take the natural gas, we'll convert it to hydrogen and capture the carbon dioxide at a centralized facility, and then take the clean, quote, hydrogen to the homes, so that they can continue to use their pipeline systems, continue to use natural gas into a future. That's the marketing idea, and it's brilliant if it worked, because it actually takes more natural gas than they used to sell. They'll sell more product, and it costs more, and they'll make more money. The problem is you can't do it without having those methane emissions, and the carbon dioxide capture just isn't that good. But it's not driven by sane, solid energy engineering. It's built by the marketing interests of the oil and gas industry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horst. Next question from me actually is that Japan, it's related to Japanese context, because as an energy importing country, that's what Japanese people, often hear, how we decorate context. But Japan is keen on take use of hydrogen as an alternative to the fossil fuels. And based on your research, does this mean that it's not a good idea? It's impossible for Japan to decarbonize net zero, to draw the net zero pathway in CO2 emissions if Japan continues to be more reliant on the hydrogen, energy. And that was, I wanted to ask you, what was kind of the key warning message from the article of Nikkei Asia, for example, in November last year to Japan?
Yeah, I mean, the key, Japan can decarbonize. I have no doubt whatsoever. Japan can embrace a fossil fuel energy future and a decarbonized future. But the key to doing that anywhere in the world, including Japan, is renewable electricity. So hydropower, wind power, maybe solar power for sure, probably wave power in Japan. You have all sorts of potential resources for the renewable electricity. Then the question is how we use that renewable electricity. And hydrogen is often not the most efficient way to do it. So, I talked about heating of homes. We don't want to do that at all. We're better off using the electricity directly with heat pumps. I think for small vehicle transportation, the same thing. A battery electric vehicle is more efficient than a hydrogen-powered car, where the hydrogen is made from renewable electricity, green hydrogen. So it's an inefficient use. You get into airplanes, and maybe hydrogen makes sense. Trains, probably direct electricity is the best use, with overhead wire transmissions rather than batteries, say. So I'm afraid that many countries in the world, including Japan, have gotten sort of the public and leadership have gotten carried away with this idea that hydrogen is the critical part of decarbonizing. Whereas I think it really should be viewed that renewable electricity is the key to decarbonizing, and using that as effectively as possible, and hydrogen has a small role to play in that. Certainly in making steel, maybe airplane transport, maybe long distance truck transport, things of that sort, but a small part of how it's often being sold.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horst. Actually, we are getting lots of questions from journalists. So although I have one question about responsible investment, but I will save it to the last part. So I will start picking up questions from the journalist. The first one is from Mr. Ishii, who is an energy journalist. Do you actually measure the price when it comes to commercial use of hydrogen? That is a first question to you, Dr. Horst, from the journalist. Do you actually measure the each cost, each kinds of cost of hydrogen when it comes to the commercial use?
So in terms of the economic cost, say,
Yes.
I mean, I'm not an economist. I'm a Earth system scientist, expert on methane and climate change, really. But I watch the economic literature on this, and hydrogen today is expensive. All forms of hydrogen are expensive, which is part of the reason it hasn't been used as a fuel source. It's cheaper, easier to use natural gas and coal, things of that sort. We produce hydrogen as a society when we need it in the oil refining industry, or when we need it for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. If you look at the price trends in hydrogen, blue hydrogen is substantially more expensive than the gray hydrogen or brown hydrogen made from coal and natural gas, because it uses more processing and because you burn more natural gas. And the prices of natural gas they've skyrocketed in the last year. People debate whether that's going to bounce around and come down or not. But long term, natural gas prices are going to continue to rise, perhaps dramatically, and that means the price of blue hydrogen will always be really, really high. Green hydrogen traditionally has been relatively expensive, but that's because the price of renewable electricity has been reasonably expensive. Price of renewable electricity has been falling globally very, very fast, and will continue to do so. Solar prices are coming down, wind prices are coming down. On top of that, there's some expense for the electrolyzer, the equipment that converts the renewable electricity into hydrogen. And the technology there has improved remarkably. I mean, the technology is old. People are doing this in 1880, but the technology has improved dramatically just in the last few years, and the prices are coming down. So I'm told that green hydrogen and blue hydrogen are about equally priced today in the market, and that within a year or two, green hydrogen will be less expensive than any of the fossil hydrogen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horst. Actually, there is a technical issue that the translation got cut off, but it got fixed out. Okay, that's good. Thank you so much. Actually, the next question is about kind of the theoretical basic part, because there's a question that saying that it was hard to understand that the methane was how methane got released and the reason why when the blue hydrogen got burned. So
Okay.
could you a little bit explain again?
I went through that too quickly. I apologize.
Should I maybe share screen then as well?
You could go back to I think I had a slide listing the various ways that methane is. Yeah, go back a few. Where are we? Probably now. Let's see. Let's go up in numbers a little bit. So a bit bigger numbers.
Okay.
I'm having a hard time reading the slide here. Well, I can.
Okay, then I will just.
I can address it with that.
Okay.
I went through it quickly, and my apologies for that. I've worked on research on these methane emissions from the oil and gas industry since about the last 14 years, and I've written a lot of papers on it, and I talk a lot on it, so I went through it quickly. The problem is how we develop and use the natural gas. It's not per se at the plant where the blue hydrogen is made. It's related to the natural gas before it even gets to the plant. Okay, so in order to develop natural gas, we're emitting some at the site when we drill wells. As I mentioned, particularly with shale gas development, the shales that the methane is in are deep in the earth. They're usually in areas where there's been historical oil and gas development, often historical coal development, which also releases some methane. And from that, there are pockets of methane gas trapped underground. And when the industry drills down through that history to get to the shale, they release some of that methane. So that's right off the bat. Just drilling a well will release some. the pipelines themselves leak to some extent, but as I say, a bigger issue is the emissions which are purposeful. So in sort of reverse order from the slide that we're not looking at, pipeline maintenance is a big problem, big issue. You can't do maintenance on a high pressure gas transmission pipeline if it's full of gas. You have to get the gas out of it. Otherwise, it'll explode when you start welding. And the only thing the industry has, the only technology they know is to just release that gas to the atmosphere. You can't slowly take it to customer because it has to be pressurized to get to the customer. So it's not an everyday occurrence. It's only when they do maintenance, but cumulatively, it's a lot of gas that's released that way. And there's no way to get the gas to market without doing that. Similarly, when you store gas, you don't want the pressure to build up too much because it's explosive. So they regulate the pressure by letting some of it vent off to the atmosphere unburned. Sometimes they try to burn that in what's called flaring, but the flares don't burn particularly effectively. So it's just all along the way, there are leaks and there are these purposeful emissions. And the best data is that a little over 3.5% of the methane that's in natural gas, no matter how you use the natural gas, is emitted unburned to the atmosphere before it gets to the customer. So in this case, the plant that's making the blue hydrogen is the customer. And when they're using that gas, they have to take responsibility for the methane emissions that have occurred before it even gets there. It's an inherent part of using natural gas. And, 3.5% is not a huge amount, right? And yet it globally is important. That's what's driving that footprint I showed you.
Thank you so much. The next question is about kind of the communications, how it's discussed. So as you mentioned a little, that is a question. As you mentioned a little, the U.S. government used clean hydrogen, not green, often recently.
Right.
But the question, the person who questioned this question, who raised up this question, doesn't seem like he can't see the kind of exact definition of which hydrogen is what. So his question is, his or her question is, what do you think about the blue hydrogen and or more, even more, high burdening hydrogen to environment? What do you estimate? How do you estimate the risk of mixing those high burdening hydrogen pieces under clean labeling? That is a question.
Well, again, I think this is a marketing ploy by the industry, right? I mean, they invented the blue hydrogen idea in 2015 after COP21 because, how else do you deal with their carbon capture idea to get gas to a home? They were unhappy when our paper came out in August of 2021, and the clean hydrogen name is, it's clearly a response to that. They started about 2 months after our paper came out, they started rebranding it, right, to drop it because blue hydrogen was starting, at least in the United States, to get this sort of bad name. So the clean hydrogen name is embedded in US law now. We had two acts, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act that passed in the fall of 2021 and the Inflation Reduction Act that passed in the spring of 2022. Both talk about clean hydrogen. They don't separate out green and blue. They just talk about clean hydrogen. And that language was forced and compromised through our very, very closely divided government by Senator Joe Manchin, clearly working at the behest of the oil and gas industry. So this is still oil and gas marketing. The only truly clean hydrogen is green hydrogen. There's no way you can really pretend that the blue hydrogen will be clean. The second bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, says if we can get the emissions below 4 kilograms carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram a hectare, then we'll call that clean. Well, the numbers I gave you are up around 25, nowhere near 4. It's a tremendous, tremendous lift to get it down to 4. And industry knows that, but now what they're marketing is saying, well, if you fund us to do research, we'll find a way to do that. We'll improve the carbon capture. We'll reduce the methane emissions. We'll find a way to do it. a huge burden. And I think all they're really doing is buying time to continue to sell us gas through their current pipeline system. It's a delaying and a distracting technique. I don't think it's a realistic effort.
Thank you so much. Just one question back to Japanese about going back to Japanese context, and it seems like Japanese government is trying to produce hydrogen by using the nuclear power, and it seems that the government is supporting that, and so that the government can change the images of nuclear energy in general after the Fukushima earthquake incident. And his or her question is nuclear generated hydrogen would that be included in green hydrogen in your definition?
No, it has a different color. These aren't my definitions. These come from industry, by the way. But hydrogen that comes from nuclear power plants, the industry calls pink hydrogen. And it's not involved with fossil fuels, so it's got a lower greenhouse gas footprint than the gray or brown or blue hydrogen I was talking about. I think if you believe that nuclear power makes sense, then perhaps pink hydrogen makes sense. And if you don't think nuclear power makes sense, then pink hydrogen does not make sense. But it has some of the same issues as green hydrogen. Part of my argument for how we use the green hydrogen is that the renewable electricity is such a precious resource, because we want to get fossil fuels out of generating electricity. And while we're in this transition time for the next decade or 2 or 3, we want to use that renewable electricity as efficiently as possible. The same would be true if we're going to have nuclear electricity. And I'm not a big fan of nuclear electricity, but that's a Japanese decision. If we're going to have nuclear power plants, we also want to use that electricity as efficiently as possible so that we can move away from the fossil natural gas generated and coal generated carbon.
Thank you. And another question is that it's about how it's used. Japanese gas company is planning to collect the CO2 from the emissions from the factories, and they are using the green hydrogen to create the methane and replace the commercial use gas, actually. And what do you think about this practice?
I haven't heard much about it. It seems like a poor idea. Off the top of my head, it doesn't make much sense to me.
Thank you so much.
To me, whether our hydrogen is green or pink, you want to use it very effectively. Clean steel, that makes a lot of sense. A few other uses, but anything much beyond that. And replacing the hydrogen we use to make synthetic fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer is important to agriculture globally, and using green hydrogen there, I think, makes a lot of sense. But most uses beyond that, I don't think that's based on good policy.
Thank you so much. Actually, this might be the last question, but I wanted to ask you this question. The last year, the ISS ESG, one of the proxy advisor who advise investors as well, not only companies, investors, put out the research that blue hydrogen related assets could cause companies, investors, big impairments risk. It's called stranded asset risk in recently in climate world, and lots of projects are going on in blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, in hydrogen industry in Japan. And we, based on your keynote, it seems that we should expect not only opportunities but also the financial risks as well from these industries. And what is your message to Japanese investors and people who are in responsible investments and who are covering business industry to the journalists, what is your message to Japan?
That's a wonderful question, and it's important to Japan. It's important globally. I think anyone who's investing their own money in blue hydrogen is doing so at extreme risk. If you're able to just use government subsidies and not your own money, it's still a waste of money, but it's someone else's waste. Blue hydrogen is never going to be part of our energy future, quite aside from the footprint issues that I talked about. As I mentioned briefly, the price of green hydrogen is coming down relative to blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen's not even going to make economic sense in 5 to 10 years, even if it were clean like the industry claims, which it's not. So it's a terrible thing to be investing in. Beyond that, I'd be very careful in investing in hydrogen without careful thought as to how it will be used, because I think there's been so much hype, a lot of it generated from the oil and gas industry and carried along in advertising and media that they influence, that some of that's carried over to green hydrogen as well. And I think people are, here in New York State, people are starting to talk about investing in hydrogen filling stations for cars. Well, we don't have any hydrogen cars in New York State. There are hardly any globally. Toyota is the only company globally that's ever seriously talked about making hydrogen cars, and Toyota's backing away from that towards battery electric vehicles, as all other car manufacturers have, because of the economics and because of the efficiencies and all. And so why would anyone start talking about building a new infrastructure for hydrogen cars anywhere? It's a hype that's getting carried along, and I think that's going to be a stranded asset as well. I would use extreme caution.